Welcome to Global Money Talk, brought to you by Sampro TV. Greetings to all of our viewers from across the U.S., Korea, and around the world. We're coming to you live from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in New York City, the financial capital of America. I'm Remy Blaire, and joining me today here at the New York Stock Exchange for our market briefing and also to weigh in on the top stories of the day is Tai Wong, independent proprietary trader. Happy Wednesday, Tai. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, good morning, Remy. It's a good day today. Well, first of all, it's Global Cat Day. I don't want to get into the politics of cats. It's also Oscar Wilde's birthday. But most importantly, I want to give a shout out. It's my son Luke's 21st birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Luke. I remember very well, the day he was born, 21 years ago. And if you're a baseball fan, it was the Yankees-Red Sox Game 7 of the 2003 American League Championship Series. And a friend of mine called and said, "Hey, I got tickets, you want to go?" And I'm like,
"Oh my goodness.
I don't think I can go." And plus, they're probably going to lose anyway. So, it's a couple minutes after midnight. Aaron Boone comes out, it was the 11th inning. Wife's asleep. Actually, Luke's not far from me, and there's a little thing they keep the babies in, the infants in. And he hits that home run, and I couldn't scream. I just went. It was quite a moment. So just reliving that a little bit. It's a good day.
Well, congratulations to your son. 21 is a big birthday, so I hope you get to celebrate with him this weekend.
Yeah, he's coming back from school this weekend, and the whole family will be together, so looking forward to it.
Oh, well, congratulations, and I hope he gets a good celebration for his 21st.
Thank you.
Well, I do want to take a look at the markets today because we did open on a mixed note. We saw higher trading for the equity averages, but right now we're seeing mixed trading. So let's start out by looking at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So the Dow is still in positive territory, up by 0.5% or over 200 points, and this does come after the declines yesterday and the rally on Monday. Meanwhile, the Nasdaq Composite Index is seeing red, and it is slightly below the flat line this morning. While the S&P 500, we are eyeing key levels here, and it is just barely positive this morning. So we do have a lot to get to. So let's start out by looking at ASML because we saw that sell-off yesterday, and this was happening while we were on the show.
Literally on the air, we're looking at Nvidia and Broadcom, and everybody was getting everything was getting hit. And it turns out it's ASML. It's a Dutch company, and they basically make the machines that almost everybody uses to make chips, and they have a monopoly. Nobody else makes these machines, and they're called extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. So let's go to graphic one because I took a picture of this. I wanted our audience to see the machine that causes all these problems. So it's a pretty massive machine. $175 million a pop. The next generation is going to be $380 million a pop. And the magic of this machine is it basically etches the chips that that Intel uses, that I think Nvidia also uses, that TSMC uses. So they're really the supplier for all the machines that make these really, really high-end chips. And the problem yesterday was, and of course it's because it was botched. They were supposed to release their earnings today, but they released it accidentally yesterday. And the bad thing about that also was they were supposed to have sort of a call, an earnings call, but the earnings call was scheduled for today. So all people saw was, oh my goodness, these numbers. Oh my Lord, what's wrong? So you do a little bit of drilling, and it's actually not so bad. They said bookings were down for some of these machines. The market was expecting $5.4 billion worth of these machines, but they only got just over 2.6. Oh my goodness, what causes a drop like that? And you find out later on, as more details come out, that last quarter it was 2.6. So this quarter they actually, well, first of all, they beat earnings, and they edged up a little bit in bookings, but the street had expected almost a doubling for whatever reason. Maybe because they felt that there's huge demand for these AI-related chips, and it's not coming. So in addition, the company has said that we're getting a lot fewer orders because people have stocked up on chips and these machines over the pandemic and right after the pandemic, so they wouldn't run into the chip shortage again. So we're seeing AI-related chips very strong, but everything else is a little soft. So people aren't buying these machines. I mean, at 175 million a pop, maybe if you don't need it, you don't buy it immediately. You can, wait, for the next model or the year after that. But nevertheless, their gross profit is around 50%, which is really remarkable. I mean, Apple, as amazing as it is probably in the, I want to say 38%-ish range of gross profit. 50% gross profit is amazing, and you can do that when you're the only manufacturer of this. So, but as I looked at the chart, I don't like this chart. This chart scares me a little bit. It reached a high of 1100 in July. Yesterday, I think it was trading something around maybe 850 or so, and now it's under 700. I'm not sure if we can pull up a picture of that, but if we can, it's okay. You get lower highs, lower lows. I think there's a trade in it. If it drops to the lows of 2024, sort of another, maybe down to 600 or 650. But it's a trade. I think you're in there for 5-8%, and I think you want to take profit because this does worry me. I don't like the looks of this chart, and if the demand for chips other than AI remains sort of stagnant, I think it's got a little more room to go.
And Tai, in terms of price action, we're seeing ASML shares down over nearly 6% in today's session, and this does come on the heels of yesterday's losses as well. But what did you make of the accidental release of those earnings report? Because there's a lot of criticism regarding that.
I mean, in the business we call it a fat finger, right? Or somebody thought, oh, it's supposed to come, it's supposed to come out on Wednesday, and the guys go, yeah, okay, Wednesday the 15th, right, and clicks it right in. And I mean, we've had some flubs where some major data got released, the U.S. government data got released accidentally early, and it causes a lot of dislocation. I mean, this is about as a pretty big dislocation for this stock. I mean, down 15-16% yesterday, another 5 or 6% today, and it really dragged the markets down yesterday because the market was just sort of panicking, and it's hitting the biggest growth stocks. Nvidia's down, Broadcom's down yesterday. So, a bit of a fat finger. They'll be more careful next time, but occasionally these things happen.
Yeah, and I do agree with you because we do know these accidental fat finger mistakes do happen, and when it comes to unexpected events like this, there might be an overreaction, but you highlighted the volatility, right, that we've been seeing. So even yesterday when we saw United Healthcare, they were down by as much as 10% earlier in the morning, and that did weigh on the Dow Industrials as well, but we're starting to see a lot of volatility in terms of reaction, and I think it was interesting to see how much the other semiconductor names or chip makers sold off in reaction.
Yes, it really it hit the market completely unawares. And I guess the problem with single name stocks is sometimes you get this volatility, especially around earnings. As a matter of fact, I mean, I can't guarantee it, but I was looking at the chart, and there's a big gap in like early July, a big gap down. I'm gonna bet that that was due to probably an earnings that came out where the stock is trading at one level and then it just gaps. There's a gap, and for those of us who've traded foreign exchange commodities, you're actually not used to that. You actually have like sort of a continuous market and a lot of different players. But in a single name stock, sometimes there aren't people won't sell options very cheaply because an earnings goes the wrong way. I mean, I remember Netflix. Remember one year, one quarter they had like negative subscriber growth and the thing cratered. I mean, if you sold a put, you'd never be able to hedge it. And sometimes when these earnings come out after hours, you won't be able to hedge it for hours, so you just don't know where it's going to come up again. So the single name stocks can be very, very volatile.
And speaking of single name stocks, another name we're paying attention to this morning as earnings season continues is Morgan Stanley. So now that we've heard from the major banking names, what do you make of the results? Any surprises?
I think the general pleasant surprise were the trading units actually did very well at these banks, and when there's volatilities or there are moves in the bond market that that sort of can be telegraphed a little bit, some of these banks can do very, very well. I also noticed, I was just looking through Market Watch and counting the major earnings that came out yesterday, and I think about 85% of the earnings beat Some of them beat a lot, some of them beat a little bit, but only a handful failed to beat. So I think Morgan Stanley was doing pretty well this
Yeah,
morning.
they are up by as much as 7% on the session this morning, and they're trading above 120 per share this morning. So considerable gains in New York morning trade for that name. And as we continue to await economic data that's coming out tomorrow, because that'll give us insight into the U.S. economy in terms of weekly jobless claims and retail sales. That is a number that's coming out at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow morning,
Yes.
and Tai and I will be bringing you that data point, all the data points tomorrow morning. But I do want to get your take on mortgage rates
Yes.
while we're talking about the U.S. economy.
So the weekly mortgage rates came out this morning, and it's up 16 basis points to 652, and that's after a 22 basis point rise last week. And this is due to the fact that after I think the most recent data, the market shifted, saying, are we, it was a big bond sort of rout, I guess. Well, rout is probably too much of a term, but the 2-year yield went above 4%. The 10-year yield went to probably 4.15 or thereabouts, and we've actually seen a substantial rally over the past few days. So next week might be a little bit better. But the other thing that was noticeable was that mortgage applications fell 17% last week. That's the biggest single week drop week to week since the pandemic. And if you exclude the pandemic, it was the biggest drop in 9 years. Now, most of that is refinancing. Refinancing dropped, I think, like 26%, where new home mortgages dropped 7%. So I guess if you really found a house that you like, and you want to buy it, renovate it, so you can get into it for next year, and get the kids in the right school system, get everybody happy. You know what? A few basis points, 20 basis points, you're going to just go ahead and do it. But for the people who really got their mortgages up at higher levels, it's I think 7.99. I want to say it got up there, right?
Yeah, that is high.
Right, and now you're saying, oh, I can refinance, but you know what? They're going to continue to cut rates. I want to wait. So I think it's going to be a volatile series. I think if we get some weaker data and these things fall back, the rates fall back off, come back off a little bit, we'll get a lot more refinancing done. But it's certainly something that you don't normally watch that closely, but we're watching it today because we expected some kind of sharp movement. We got it.
Yeah, before we move away from housing, of course, mortgage rates play into the factor, but you mentioned kids and schools, and here in the U.S., the school season tends to begin end of August or beginning of September. It's different in other parts of the world, but when it comes to college, so of course this is something that parents think about because the price tag for a 4-year college education has, and I am sure that you've personally been experiencing this, because even if you stock away for your kids' tuition from a very early age, there are different plans that you can get into to plan for that key day when your kids go off to college. But let's talk about how competitive the college landscape has become, because not only are we seeing articles about counseling for high school kids, even middle school kids, to try to get into Ivy Leagues, but in addition, apparently there are also consultants that help you get into sororities or frats, and that does seem to be a very lucrative business for some people. But let's start out with getting kids into Ivy League institutions. So do you know how competitive it is?
It's really, really competitive. I've gone through the college applications process with 3 of my kids. I'm also a volunteer in a program that helps high-performing but low-resource first-generation Hispanic kids in Westchester. You basically act as a mentor for them. And it is, the word for it, I think, it's a blood sport, how tough it is. To the Ivy League schools, you're talking about single digits, 4-5% acceptance rates. It's the same for Stanford, for MIT, schools like that. part of the reason is the process with the Common App that came on, probably 20 years ago or thereabouts, makes it a lot easier to apply to a lot of schools than it used to be. You basically fill out one app, and depending on the school, they may have some supplemental essays, but it's really easy to go ahead and do that. And also, I think there's sort of grade inflation too. Schools have really made it easy to get higher grades, and it's sort of a sad arms race, because if everybody is doing it, and you're a school so we're going to be tough, and it's really hard to get an A here, you're kind of hurting your own students in this blood sport unless you're really, really well known. And then the parents get angry, and then they want to pull your funding, so everybody has to go along. And so grades are generally good, scores are good because there's a lot of prep classes for it. And now the whole idea is, how do you stand out from the crowd? And it's funny you should mention it. There was a big story in the Wall Street Journal this morning about Crimson, I think it's called Crimson Education, this 29-year-old New Zealander, or Kiwi as we like to call it, has started this business that's being valued at $500 million with a ton of really smart investors. And they're coaching you from as early as middle school. Sometimes I know friends who live in parts of New Jersey. They're telling kids that if you pay a retainer every year when your kid starts at age 5 or 6, and I'm not kidding, 5 or 6, will prepare you to get to the school that you want. And it's feeding on a certain demographic of parents who really, really think that this is important. And it's not the be all and end all, but certainly gives you a leg up. Like I think of putting your kids in a top institution. They get to start at the front of the marathon, and they have to run their own marathon, but they start at the front of the marathon. So pretty tough. I would say that a lot of people, especially sort of the upper middle class to the affluent to the wealthy, are using consultants like these folks. Some are probably in New York City. I mean, I wouldn't $50,000 for a consultant for a year, senior year, wouldn't surprise me at all. So it's a big business.
It is, and you mentioned blood sports, so I think it's sort of befitting that this consulting business is called Crimson Education. And you went to Harvard, didn't you, right?
I did.
So you're familiar with the crimson color?
Right, certainly. And the young gentleman who's running this, who's the CEO, also went to Harvard. He's a real go-getter. I mean, he got his applied math major, degree in 3 years. Then got his master's. Went to Oxford. I think it was a Rhodes Scholar or something like that. But he's really, really driven. And his secret, and I think it's probably correct, as he says, find your kid something to do. If he's not at the top, half of 1% of that, drop it and go do something else. And it's the whole idea of standing above the crowd. I mean, Harvard brags that we could fill our entire class with valedictorians if we wanted to, and they can. But filling your entire class with valedictorians is sort of not interesting. So they're looking for folks who they think can change the world, right? The Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, though he never bothered to graduate. They gave him an honorary degree, but he never bothered to graduate. He was too busy, building out Facebook. But I think in the old days when I was applying to school, it was like you needed to be well-rounded, good in everything. Now it's be good enough in everything, which is still a challenge, but then stand out in something. Be 3-4 standard deviations above the mean. Publish a book, have a patent, definitely do something, in terms of public service. But you want to stand out. You want to be the, sort of the one flower or the one plant that stands up above all others, and then craft a narrative that shows that off and that's consistent. And that's how they make their money. And I think, and the same thing that I've done with my kids and with the kids I volunteer for, it's what's your narrative? Drill in and tell a story, a compelling story.
I think storytelling is important, as you mentioned. And before I move away from this, several years ago, pre-pandemic, I remember high school students in Palo Alto were committing suicide just because it was getting so competitive, and the extent to which this was a concern. The FBI got involved because they were so concerned about this. And sometimes when you hear stories such as this, it is good for this particular consulting business, especially with all the PE interest in it. But it also makes you wonder, should kids be allowed to just be kids instead of just focusing on something like this? Like, will they really be able to get an edge? in life.
I think, I really think the right analogy is you put them at the start of at the beginning in the front rank of the runners of the marathon, and it is literally a marathon that you're going to have a 40-year career. Does it guarantee anything? No, it doesn't guarantee anything. What it does, give you is generally speaking, a pretty good education. Although, with what we've had the scene with colleges over the past year, sometimes you wonder, and I know some of the colleges, might suffer this year. We'll know later on whether some parents are saying, I'm spending $90,000 a year to send these kids, and they're out there pitching tents and saying really god awful things. That I think has woken some people up. But also that you're in with the, what I like thinking is you're in with the A team. You're in with kids who are just like you, many of whom are really as driven and as smart, and you also build a network. So these people, you can call later on saying, hey, I need help with this, or can you recommend somebody? I'm starting a new business. So I think that those network effects and the education and getting the sorting effects of getting into some of the really hard to get jobs is important. Does that mean you can't succeed? If you go to some really great schools that are not the top 20, absolutely not. Look at the CEOs of America. I don't think too many people are actually Ivy League educated. It sort of doesn't push
Unless you drop out.
Unless you drop out, exactly. Now, but if you're going into consulting or banking or sort of private equity, they might, or law. Law is a big one. Law that that name really counts. Then those top schools are really important. But you can certainly succeed in many, many ways.
Well, Tai, we are edging closer to the half-hour mark, so why don't we end it on a lighter note with pandas. So, two giant pandas from China arrived in Washington, D.C., and this is the first time, apparently in 24 years, that the U.S. Capitol has welcomed new pandas from Beijing. And apparently the pandas were trucked to the Smithsonian's National Zoo, and they're going to be on loan for approximately 10 years with an annual fee of $1 million. And apparently this is to support conservation efforts in China. I just found it a little touching that one of the pandas has a big appetite while the other one is apparently an introvert.
Wow. So, this is, I think we haven't had pandas for several years. I think the previous pair, I think either got old or passed away or had to go back to China. But it's a huge draw in in Washington D.C. for the zoo, and this whole thing started with President Nixon in the early '70s. It was called Panda diplomacy. When Nixon went to China, and the old quote was only Nixon could go to China because he had the sort of anti-communist credentials to do so, and he opened up China, which eventually led China into the UN and other things. And it's always a nice thing to say. The pandas are only in China. There are probably only maybe a couple of hundred of them, so it's pretty nice to have one. And with all the rancor between the U.S. and China in recent years, and that will likely continue whomever actually wins in the White House, this is just a smart thing to do, right? And I think China would do so much better if they just did things like this instead of, because on the same day you get this news, China says, we will not renounce the use of force to take over Taiwan. As I mentioned before, if you actually said something different and said, you know what, they're our brothers. Let them come back whenever they want to. The world might go, whoa, this is a change, a pleasant change. And it's sort of moral suasion, gaining people's hearts and minds over time. But it's a nice thing, and we're glad to have it. They're really cool things to see. I mean, I actually saw them when I visited China with my parents 25 years ago in Chongqing, and it was before China got really big. And we were with a small tour group, and somebody asked, "Do you think we could see the pandas?" And at the time, it was like 1999. They said, "Yeah," and they talked to somebody, and they literally drove our tour bus into the center of the zoo and gave us 20 minutes to see the pandas. So that was quite wonderful. But China was really starting its big growth then, wanted to open itself and be welcome to the West, and they did really, really well in that for probably the better part of 20 years.
Well, I just thought it was very interesting, this type of diplomacy and international relations. Apparently, the plane that these pandas traveled on, it was called, nicknamed Panda Express.
The Panda
So,
Express.
yes, that made me chuckle. So, Tai, as always, thank you so much for joining me. You will be here with me for the full hour tomorrow.
Yes.
So we'll be able to cover a lot of ground in terms of the economic data releases as well as technical analysis. So make sure to watch us tomorrow.
Tune in.
Thank you so much, Tai.
Thank you.
And coming up, I will be joined by Richard Bayles, partner at Karani Asset Management, for today's Market Insight. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Global Money Talk, live from the New York Stock Exchange. The capital goods sector, also known as the industrial sector, includes companies that manufacture or distribute goods. The diverse sector also covers machinery, electrical equipment, aerospace, defense, engineering, as well as construction. Now, the sector's performance is sensitive to the economy and tends to do well when the economy is growing, but demand tends to drop and prices tend to fall when economic conditions worsen. Meanwhile, the steel industry is known for being cyclical and reflective of overall market conditions. Joining me for today's Market Insight here at the New York Stock Exchange is Richard Bayles, partner at Karani Asset Management. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining me and welcome back.
Nice to see you.
Well, last time you were here, we were talking about the steel industry, and there has been a lot of noise surrounding cyclical stocks. But how has the industry dealt with the commodity nature of the products that it sells?
Well, one way is they can't get away from the commodity nature of the business.
And so almost any commodity, steel, paper, oil and gas, they can't do much about the product. There are different classifications. You can improve the quality, but then you'll compete with somebody else's high quality product. What you really need to do is control your costs. If you have a large market and low costs, you can do rather well, even with some cyclicality. But there are measures they take. For example, they try to integrate forward into products that might have a higher margin. The problem with that is when the demand for steel is low, the demand for the steel products is low, and so you get hit with both. But if you can make the products better than somebody else, you can avoid some of the cyclicality. Essentially, however, there isn't much to be done about it except lower your costs rather ruthlessly. The history of the steel business, the little bit I know of it, illustrates this well. Andrew Carnegie became a rich man by investing at the bottom and being really tough on his competitors. As a result, he had lower costs and lower costs and lower costs, and that allowed him to get bigger. Bigger plants, they're really simply large machines. Bigger plants were more efficient, but they had to keep running, and they had to go even when there was an oversupplied market. And what that meant was that the prices were worse. When you need to sell your product, and you can't sell it on features, and you can't sell it on delivery time, and you can't sell it on any other thing, you simply lower the price. And so prices would be much more volatile than output. Okay. Steel is a difficult thing to make, or was a difficult thing to make. Coal, coking coal, iron ore, burn them together, and then refine them, and then shape them into products. That was the way for decades and decades, from the 19th century on up into the middle and beyond of the 20th century. But the only way to deal with the problems was lower your cost.
And now that we've touched upon the steel industry, I do want to move on to industrials. So when it comes to industrials as well as capital goods, that's another highly cyclical industry there. So when it comes to cyclicality of industrials, give us an idea of what we're talking about here.
Well, again, even industrial products that can change, that can develop new products, sell something that's more efficient for their customers, they do have to deal with the fact that they have a lot of fixed costs to cover, and they need to cover those all the time. Otherwise, there's a substantial deficit, and it has to be made up, and that comes out of the owner's pockets. The best thing you can do is make your product more worthwhile to the customer than the next person's product. I'll give you an example. There's a Swedish company called Atlas Copco. They have been the Copco stands for compressor company. They've been making compressors for 100 years. 100 years of compressor making has improved and improved and improved the design of the product, because the only way you're going to sell your product instead of somebody else's is not so much the price. You're both got largely the same costs. You can't really get to be much lower cost, but that your product does better things. Switch. Think of a cupcake factory. How do you get the cupcakes moving? How do you move them? They're on a conveyor belt, but you got to move them aside. How do they do that? A puff of air. Where does the air come from? It comes from a compressor. Whose idea was that? Was it the baker that figured out, I can take a compressor and move the product? No, it was a compressor manufacturer who said, look what I can do for you. So the more of that kind of thing that went on, the more and more value could be created by a compressor manufacturer. There's another element of cost that affects everybody, and that's labor cost. If you go back to the steel business, 200 years ago, well, not quite, 150 years ago, the average steel maker, average steel worker in a steel plant worked a 12-hour shift. My gosh, a 12-hour shift. It's hot, it's dirty, it's dangerous. You can fall into a molten steel. You can have somebody swing something, hit you in the... How do you make that cost low? What they thought at the time was you just keep using the workers the way you're using the equipment. Turns out workers aren't the same as equipment. They get tired, they get grumpy, they get cranky, they get hurt. So somewhere in the middle of the later part of the 19th century, there's a manager who took over for one of Carnegie's steel plants, and he decided we're not going to have 12-hour shifts, we're going to have 3 8-hour shifts. Everybody gets the same money for the 8 hours they got for the 12, but now we'll have people who are rested, they're not angry with each other, they're not in as much danger because they're alert. And productivity went way up, and they produced way more steel. So that didn't catch on at the time, but it's clearly something that modern corporations understand, or we hope they do.
Because when we think about how labor conditions were not just in the previous century, but 150 years ago, they're significantly different. It's quite a different landscape here.
Yeah, look, if you are competing to lower your cost and get an advantage, you will try as many different things as you can. And some of them may end up abusing the labor force as opposed to protecting it and incorporating it in what you do. A wonderful example, Costco is incredibly efficient in all of their warehouses, and they pay the highest amount of anybody in the warehouse/retailing business, and they provide the most generous health care benefits. What do they get? They get the lowest turnover in the industry. They get long-term employment. If I've been doing the same job every year for 20 years, I'm probably going to be a lot better at it, more efficient, higher output than the person we hire this week to start their career. So one of the elements of cost control is labor relations. And the companies that have the best labor relations, whose employees feel that they are treated well, they're safe, and they're respected, do the best. I think actually the most important of those three is the respect part.
Yes, I do have to agree with you, because when we think about the costs that might be associated with hiring as well as other training costs, it is better to retain and maintain a better culture, and that is something that we don't hear much about in this modern day and age, especially when it comes to the labor market. And we are seeing strikes, whether we're talking about port strikes or other industries as well. So perhaps a history lesson for some of these executives might be in order. But I do want to take a look at capital goods industries, in particular companies. So we know that they do tend to have a multiplier effect on the economy here. So when it comes to performance, given that they're sensitive to fluctuations in the business cycle, in your experience, what do you think makes for a good company in this space?
Let's take a really terrific example. Yesterday, I think a company called ASML, which is in Holland, and makes the enormous machines. I think it takes 6 airplanes to move them from where they're made to where they're used, 747s. They announced that they're going to have a slightly, or not so slightly, less good outlook. Stock went down 15%. It's down again today, I believe. The fear of cyclicality. Oh my gosh, it won't be as good as we thought it would be. How does a shareholder overcome that? A shareholder can't overcome the daily, weekly, even quarterly fluctuations for things they may not know about, that didn't consider or weren't informed about. They were told, my gosh, the outlook is great, and now the outlook isn't, and you didn't have much warning. Take a long-term perspective. If you'd owned ASML for the last 6 or 8 years, you care about the 15%, but it hasn't really hurt your returns. And so, from a shareholder's point of view, a very long perspective is probably the best defense against the cyclicality. And generally speaking, there will be times when people will get disgusted with, oh my gosh, it's too volatile, I couldn't tell what was coming, and sell it to you at a cheaper price. So when you start with a cheap price and hold for a long time in a successful business, you'll do fine.
And when we're talking about cyclicality, just for our viewing audience, can you clarify what we're talking about here in terms of years?
Oh, if we only knew. If you take the last cycle, the cycle we either have the cycle we may be in, that cycle very well could be the longest we've ever been in. The only pause we had was over COVID, and if you want to say, I get a timeout for COVID, nobody could have known that that was going to slow things down. Then the economy's been expanding in the United States and elsewhere since the mid-teens. Before that, it was 4 or 5 years. I have a good friend who says, we're in a wonderful business. The economy and the markets go up 4 out of 5 years. So 4 out of 5 years is pretty good. It's better than a great average in baseball. So cyclicality is part of what we live with. It comes from the nature of fixed costs and is more exaggerated for those that have higher fixed costs. So to go back to what do companies do to try to ameliorate things? One way to ameliorate the cyclicality is to not make very much. Assemble rather than make. So go back to Atlas Copco. They buy the screws and the steel parts that make a compressor, and then they assemble those. If you assemble, somebody else is taking that piece of fixed cost away from you. There's a company we have an interest in called Rational. It makes what are called combi steamers, capital goods for the restaurant business. So they are cookers that provide steam and convection and electronic microwave heat, all in the same piece of equipment. And that piece of equipment allows a restaurant to make more things simultaneously than they can do with standard equipment. It saves a lot of money, saves space, and so on. But what's important about Rational is they don't make anything much. They buy their semiconductors, they buy stainless steel cabinets, they buy all of the nozzles, they buy all of the hoses. And so one person assembles a piece of equipment and then stamps his name on it, which is a bit of extra pride and respect that's really quite important. Again, respect is a powerful thing.
And Richard, I do want to ask you about incentives when it comes to this industry. So can you tell us more about incentives as one of the key differentiators of what makes these great companies?
Incentives are really hard. Charlie Munger once said, show me your incentives and I'll show you the output. You can really screw them up. A few years ago, Wells Fargo decided we should have more of our customers own more credit cards. So they put in a set of incentives that got people to get the customers to buy more, to get more credit cards. What they got was a lot of inappropriate purchases of credit cards, people who didn't know what they had bought, and a whole snafu that really ended up damaging customer relations. So be careful as to what you ask for. One of the things that is really helpful is getting to this question of respect. I think people, there's a TED Talk by a guy by the name of Pete Stavros. He's a leader at KKR. I was about to say partner, but it's not quite the same thing. He's a leader at KKR of their private equity. He's done a TED Talk on how they provide the financial incentives for a company that they have bought. Everybody gets a stock certificate. Everybody gets some an interest in the business, along with KKR and KKR's investors. So when that business is sold, it can be transforming. More important, or at least as important, is that when people know they have a share of the business, they behave differently, they think differently. One anecdote is from a company called Overhead Door, which is in the TED Talk and they use broadly. It's a driver. Guy, the Overhead Doors plants in north central Illinois. So they're delivering garage doors around the upper Midwest. And the guy's driving the truck. And he's got to go to Minnesota and Wisconsin. And on one trip, he had to go up to Door County, which is in the northern part of Wisconsin, way out of his way. And he said to the people in the business, listen, if I were still working and earning my pay by miles driven, I wouldn't tell you this. But I know that we don't make any money paying me to deliver that door up in Door County. It's too far, it's too expensive, it's got to be destroying our profitability. Figure out a different schedule. I think that's the kind of thing you get when you engage people, engage their financial interest, and get them to think about where they are working and how they can contribute. But the principal idea, I believe, is that it's respect.
Well, you do highlight both the risks as well as rewards when it comes to incentives. And I'm really curious, Richard, so what ended up happening with this company that you just mentioned in terms of what they ended up doing?
Well, they got sold. I can't remember, but I believe KKR owned them for 6 or 8 years. Mm-hmm. And KKR bought them from another private equity firm. But because of the reorganization they'd been able to do, the rethinking of it, they sold the business, actually, to Nucor, the steel company. Think about it. You make an overhead door with rails of steel, and so it fits a bit with Nucor's attempt to move downstream and to integrate into the products rather than just not simply the steel. And it was a very successful purchase for all of the people who worked there. They got to pay off their home mortgage. They got to send their kids to college. They got to do a lot of things that, in a different environment with a different kind of deal, they're only a modest percentage of the total value. But it was huge value to the people who worked there. And as I say, I think they created a great deal of that value because of their ability to have input into the business.
And you have highlighted some of the rewards that come with incentives, but do you have any examples of misplaced incentives?
Well, the Wells Fargo one is famous. The problem of the stevedore strike that just was raised, just ended. Who's going to pay for the obvious automation that's going to come? if I'm the owner of the shipping business and I try to put it all off on the workers, I'm really going to be troubled. So I'm going to have to make a deal where some of the value that will come from replacing the people with robots goes to the people who are replaced. I'm not going to be able to figure that out, but lots of people are. Different example. Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, or merged with McDonnell Douglas. And Boeing's in such difficulty now that it's easy to point fingers and say how badly they were managed. But there was one thing early on that they did. Boeing doesn't sell airplanes. Boeing sells air safety. If their planes don't work, or if they crash, nobody's going to ride in them, and if nobody rides in them, none of the airlines is going to buy them, no matter what the price is. So air safety is not a commodity, it's a requirement. Shortly after the McDonnell Douglas merger, Boeing moved its headquarters, the executives, out of Seattle and away from the production. So what a business that was built on the marriage of engineering and construction and management, suddenly one of those pieces wasn't there. Oh, you guys figure it out. We've got better things to do. Probably led to some shortfalls, corner cutting and other problems that have put Boeing in the place where they now have to raise some capital because they've not done what the business had been doing for decades.
And that brings me to my next question. So you brought up the example of Boeing, and we're seeing this right now being played out in terms of negotiations and the new chief executive officer. One thing that I've noticed that you've mentioned is respect, and that is a key word. And I wonder, just based on your observations of companies, not just in industrials, but also other sectors as well, what has happened in the past several years when it comes to corporate culture, when we think about Milton Friedman, for example, and what he said about corporations and what the responsibility is of an organization? What is your take, just based on observations of corporations in this day and age?
What I think Milton Friedman said was the social purpose for a business is to make a profit. Well, that's fine. And I don't see how you can disagree with that. How do you make your profit? Do you make your profit in 1 year and then the hell with what happens later because you've been able to squeeze everybody and squeeze everything and get away with a lot? No, of course not. You have to remember that a corporation is meant to be immortal, or at least very long-lived. And how is it going to be that? It's going to be that when the employees and the management work together. Are they going to work together if I cut your if I cut your health insurance to save money so that I make my quarterly number? The quarterly number becomes a lot more important than not just my insurance, but my child's broken leg. That's not respect. That's not what this is all about. The best profit, the most profitable companies tend to be those that have not just labor peace or cooperation, but input. We ought to do this. We can do that. Think of that driver who says, don't send me up there to deliver that door. It's not profitable. Let's figure out something else. When you have a company doing that, the returns on assets, the cash flow, and all of those things go way up. You can listen to the Milton Friedman idea and say, well, that's meant to just coddle the workers. It's not coddling at all. It's cooperation. It's respecting each other. If the people working in your company think you're a jerk, they're probably not going to work as hard as if they think you're really smart. I'm going to tell, there's an example of that. Hewlett-Packard was one of the most successful, still is a reasonably successful business. But for decades, from the garage in Palo Alto into the 90s, it was really successful. Why? Everybody who worked there thought they had a personal story with either Bill or Dave. Dave Packard, Bill Hewlett. They knew them. They trusted them. They had seen them working on engineering problems. More to the point, there are lots of things that Hewlett-Packard did to run the business well. One of them was they bought a large tract of land in Northern California, and anybody who worked at Hewlett-Packard could go camping there, could take their family there. It was a huge and unique perk. Didn't cost them a lot of money, but it was rooted in the sense of, come on guys, we can all camp together. Hewlett and Packard retired. They were replaced by pretty good company executives, but they weren't Bill and Dave, and they didn't have that connection, and they didn't figure out how to make it happen. So.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to how we live in different times, and there tends to be so much focus on innovation when it comes to technology, but not so much when it comes to corporate culture. And we know when we're talking about the example of Milton Friedman that the Business Roundtable has updated their statement regarding corporate social responsibility.
Right.
But I think it would be great for us to round up today's discussion on industrials by talking about where you see opportunities in industrials and the capital goods sector, especially when it comes to that key term you mentioned, which is respect and of course trust, because it's easier to say than to actually build here.
Okay. Well, I mentioned Atlas Copco. Let me tell you a couple of things about them as well. Every job except CFO and CEO, I believe, is posted within the company, all the managerial work. So if you say, geez, you know, I might like to live in India and I can do this job and it just came up, you're free to apply for it. That means that everybody gets some chance, some say, some chance to say where they want to work, how they want to work, what they'd like to do. They don't have to go outside the company to explore a new idea. They can keep their experience within. The business is enormously decentralized. The people in headquarters essentially allocate capital and very little else. So all of the business problems, all of the new designs for products, how are we going to get to market? How much are we going to do in terms of sales? How are we going to develop our service business? That, by the way, is one of the ways a cyclical company tries to ameliorate its business. They sell parts and service throughout time. It's helpful. It's quite helpful sometimes. It does soften the blow of a decline in economic activity. But it isn't perfect, because when they're not using your product, they're not wearing it out, and they're not replacing it. Nevertheless, if you take this kind of openness and decentralization, you get not just one set of people doing R&D and study, you get the company doing that, and it's a very big help. So Atlas has a broad, diverse capital goods program. They have a orderly, marvelous transition in the leadership. We've owned it for several years, and I think we've seen 4 CEOs. I joked to somebody, they all looked alike. But the most recent guy is not from Sweden, he's from Brazil. So he doesn't quite look alike, but they all do look alike. They're running the business by this same sort of open book kind of way. And down in the business units, people are working for their unit, for their company, their colleagues, and they create that kind of mutuality.
Well, Richard, we are all out of time for today. Thank you so much for weighing in on the steel industry as well as industrials. It was very interesting to hear your perspective and very insightful as well. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
My pleasure. And that will do it for Global Money Talk, live from the New York Stock Exchange. We're so excited to bring you daily coverage here on SamPro TV. You can check out the show anytime on our YouTube channel by searching Global Money Talk. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow morning. Have a wonderful day.